Also, the delta between older Americans and millennials and those younger than millennial continues to widen. Only half of millennials, according to the Pew Research Center, describe themselves as Christians, and 4 in 10 immediately identify as religious nones. Again, that's Nones. This effect has landed most notably within the Democratic Party. So historically, the Democratic Party has been a sanctuary for religious dissidents, people who were outside the mainline white Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition. My own relatives who were immigrants from Poland, sought sanctuary in the Democratic Party of urban centers. That's been at least that's been the pattern in American demographics. But at this point, about 6 out of 10 people who identify or lean towards the Democratic Party say they attend a religious service no more than a few times a year. And more than 4 in 10 self-identified white Democrats are religious nones, Nones. And again, this is from the same Pew Research Data Center. And fully 7 in 10 white Democrats say that they attend religious service no more than a few times a year. So within 30 years, the Democratic Party, which had always been a sanctuary for religious minorities and those among persecuted religious groups, went from enacting and pushing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993 to 2019, at least sponsoring legislation that would expressly restrict the application of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So you see this in the 2019 Equality Act and No Harm Act, which are both sponsored by Democratic leaders. I think this cultural move towards religious disaffiliation is most pronounced in one of our major national parties, which had always been a sanctuary, a perceived and real sanctuary for persecuted religious minorities. So I think this in part explains why there's maybe less support for religious liberty as a general principle. I'd also refer the audience to a book by Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton. It's a famous book at this point. It's a 2005 book entitled Soul Searching. And even what those authors find there is even within persons who identify as Christian, it doesn't necessarily reflect an orthodox strain, especially when it comes to some of the traditional tenets of Christianity. So I'll quote directly from that book. A significant part of Christianity in the United States is actually only tenuously Christian in any sense that is seriously connected to the actual historical Christian tradition, but has rather substantially morphed into what the authors call moralistic therapeutic deism. So MTD, as that phrase is abbreviated, consists of 5 tenets. Number 1, a God exists who created the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God need not to be involved in one's life except when needed to resolve a problem. This is sort of the Santa Claus view of the Creator. And then number 5, good people go to heaven when they die. So these are sort of the broad general tenets of what is an emerging actual civil religion of moralistic therapeutic deism. So where the polling data and some of the litigation reflects a divergence from what was the majority sort of baseline Christian default in American public life, I think that book and subsequent research reflects the shift away from a more orthodox strain of Christianity as a majoritarian religion to something resembling moralistic therapeutic deism instead. The next factor, at least demographically and sociologically, that has affected an evaporation of any religious consensus is the sexual revolution. And this really begins at the midpoint of the 20th century, continues through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And in 2015, I published an article at the National Catholic Register that noted that the cultural upheaval of the sexual revolution had culminated in the effective deregulation of sex. at the local, state, and national level. So as you track the legislation and the litigation, rules and regulations which were relevant to cohabitation, adultery, alienation of affection, divorce, contraception, abortion, and pornography, essentially evaporated as a matter of public policy, either through legislation or litigation. And so this is reflected in sort of the emergent mainstream view of such issues. In fact, the Pew Research Center data collected in 2019, and this is December 2019, so it's at the very end of the year, that data reflected an extant majority of mainline Protestants, an emergent majority of Roman Catholics, and an expected majority of young evangelicals support the deregulation of sex and personally engage in lifestyle choices that are consistent with that change. And with the exception of abortion, which remains controversial among self-identified Roman Catholics and evangelicals, you find even self-identified Christians assimilating to this new mainstream belief system. So I think that's a factor that is reflected in the continued litigation of so-called culture war issues. You have, even among self-identified Catholics, evangelicals, and Protestants, an assimilation to a post-sexual revolution worldview that affects the consensus that you may have seen at the turn of the 20th century. That consensus is now evaporated on those issues in the 21st century. And finally, I would like to point to a book I recently completed, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. This is a 2020 volume by Carl Trueman, a professor who works in this space. And it is an interesting summary of the 400-year history of metaphysical, philosophical thought in the West, and it can be broken down into 4 parts. And I think he does explain some of the underlying metaphysics and philosophical changes that have taken place in the West generally, and in the United States in particular. And in part 1, Professor Trueman analyzes the work of sociologist Philip Rieff, philosopher Charles Taylor, and ethicist Alasdair MacIntyre to explain how modernity affected an inward focus on therapeutic fulfillment and authentic self-definition and self-actualization. So he contrasts this with earlier views of purpose and the meaning of life, which were always outward focused and focused on external objective facts and actions. As they document through sociology, philosophy, and ethics, there's been a definite shift towards therapeutic fulfillment, the inward self, and self-definition. Part 2 analyzes some of the philosophical work that underlies this shift, specifically the works of Rousseau, Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin. It then dovetails those works with literature and the arts. So romantics like Percy Shelley and William Blake explain the 18th and 19th century shift in teleology. So moving from a medieval and a Renaissance model, which focuses on theistic, external, objective, and embodied definitions of personhood, you see with this philosophical and ethical shift a near atheistic focus on internal, subjective, and sensual materialism. And instead of a focus on personhood and the person's relationship to the creator, you see instead a focus on power and the politics of power. In part 3, Professor Trueman explains how all of these philosophies and aesthetics of power were then sexualized in the works of Sigmund Freud, William Reich, and Marcuse. And they theorized that maximal sexual expression was necessary to free the human person from harmful restraint or oppression. So here you see an infusement of psychology and some new definitions of the human person, the human person sexualized, which certainly explains some of the culture war topics that are percolating through the culture and the courts right now. And then in part 4, Professor Trueman explains how the 300-year trajectory of part 1, part 2, and part 3 converged and culminated in the sexual revolution in the latter half of the 20th century. And what emerges from there is a worldview that is opposed to any constraint on self-definition, self-actualization, and self-satisfaction. moral, ethical, theological, or otherwise. And so I think this book explains in DNA form the underlying sociological, philosophical, and ethical and metaphysical reasons for this shift, and why even people who self-identify with an Abrahamic religion, whether it's Christian, Jewish, LDS, or even Muslim, nonetheless are affected by this cultural shift. And I think that shows up in some of the culture war cases that Professor Soni references. So where are we now? When combined, these sociological, theological, and theoretical factors generate a culture that is focused on expressive individualism, self-definition, and therapeutic affirmation. It combines to create a politics that prioritizes expression over free exercise, prioritizes sex over religion, and safe spaces over debate and dialogue. And finally, in the law, you see a shift in emphasis away from hard rules of damages, case, and controversy towards an emphasis on dignitarian harms. You see this reflected in recent Supreme Court cases addressing targeting and animus, the idea that there is no bright line, but the court will intervene in a case in controversy where there is perceived mistreatment of a minority, religious or otherwise, where there is targeting, where there is provable animus. This certainly reflects the emphasis on psychology and the therapeutic mode. So I think that explains why we are there. And in conclusion, I'd make reference to an amicus brief that I participated in when I was in the nonprofit sector. It's a case that did not end up, the Supreme Court did not end up granting cert in the case, but it's an interesting case nonetheless. It's Knight versus Thompson. My colleagues and I joined Emory University professors there to argue that Native Americans historically suffered greater scrutiny in federal courts precisely because their religious beliefs and practices were unfamiliar and idiosyncratic to the court and the culture. This is most well illustrated by the infamous Ling case, where Native Americans struggled to explain to the court how the progress of the Industrial Revolution interfered with certain beliefs they had about sacred land and burial rights. As discussed in Knight v. Thompson vis-a-vis Native Americans, as traditional Abrahamic beliefs move more and more into a minority position and self-identified nuns increase, the percentage of Protestant, Catholic, and evangelical traditionalists decreases, and self-identified Christian practice of a faith begins to resemble moralistic therapeutic deism or something consonant with the sexual revolution. As a consequence, any plaintiff, any defendant in a case that runs afoul of this new extant civil religion will increasingly find themselves outside the mainstream and struggling to explain to the court in a case in controversy the nature of their beliefs. And as Native Americans have long struggled to explain to a majority of the court the nature of their beliefs and why lines must be drawn vis-a-vis free exercise, traditional Abrahamic beliefs, which are falling outside the mainstream, will be harder and harder to explain both to the court and to legislatures. So I think all of the above explains why we are where we are.